boss fight rather than an actual raid.
World
Um,
bosses.
right. So kind of my personal definition of raiding is basically when require basically kind of like looking at content that requires a large group of players to accomplish. Usually it's centered around either fighting a boss or fighting a series of bosses. That's kind of why the Plains of Eidolon at night kind of feel like a little bit like a raid because it's a series of bosses.
Right.
But I think because you have because you only have 4 people, like I kind of hesitate to call it a raid. Although, like, I guess thinking about it a bit more though, like you do need a different skill set than you need like for a lot of other content. And maybe that's a little bit better of a definition. Is basically like something that requires a different skill set. Because raiding in the MMOs a lot of times requires you to do things that are different than running dungeons or farming content or whatever else you want to do. And some of that additional skill it comes from organizing larger groups of people. When you have like in Final Fantasy you have four people in a party. But then you go into the Alliance raid where you have like 3 groups of 8 people. That kind of changes how things go. So,
I think just talking about the definition of raiding real fast.
mm-hmm.
I think Destiny in particular, even though it cries to not want to be an MMO, it's still a fucking MMO.
Right.
I think their raid size is the same as their normal party size, but it's hard content. So
right.
It requires that like static coordination.
Right.
So I think that's a little loose of like a definition for raiding, but
yeah, I mean,
I think it can be argued. Is all I'm saying.
I mean, you're good at arguing.
I mean, hi.
For no reason. Anyway,
sorry, I have to side with the jar like I usually do. Even when I'm trying to argue with the jar, I end up agreeing with him. So, anyways, continue.
Well, yeah, I think yeah. I mean, I guess like the more classic definition is basically having a larger group of people. And rating has changed over time. Kind of looking at like a lot of the early raids were basically I'll give the caveat here. Like I'll talk a little bit about the history of raiding here, and so I'm going to go off of my knowledge, and this isn't necessarily like authoritative.
Are you saying this is an opinion show?
It's not quite an opinion, but this is not a thoroughly heavily researched show where we went and interviewed people and and dug up a whole bunch of information. So this is just kind of me recounting reading from my as I understand it from a game design perspective is that one of the earliest raids was basically kind of started in EverQuest, where EverQuest was basically was heavily based off the Deku style MUDs, and they basically put some like really tough monsters into the world. And so like one of the things that they put one of the things they one of the bits of content was basically these planes of power, where they basically kind of like in D&D you have like the elemental planes, the outer planes, the astral plane, things like that. They kind of did something similar, but they had like these big avatars of the gods that you basically were essentially unkillable under normal group size. And in EverQuest, like normal group size, I think it was 6. And so like a lot of content was kind of built around the idea that you'd have 6 people. And so what happens then is that people basically banded together, and there was no like raid structure. It's literally just a group of people that decide like all kind of verbally decide we're gonna go and attack this thing together. and then try to basically kind of try to coordinate and figure out strategies. And so EverQuest was kind of interesting in several ways, for people used to kind of more modern games. Oh shit, I forgot to switch back to Ember.
Cause anyway, she's gonna be a heel bitch.
I'm exiting after the first wave.
Oh, are you being serious?
Yeah. Well, because I don't have a lens in Oberon.
Okay, fine. Anyways,
so EverQuest was kind of interesting if you look at it from people used to more modern MMOs, in that it was open world. It didn't really have instances, and so these basically these giant monsters were essentially free for all. And so you would, once you killed the monster, whoever basically had tagged it would basically be able to loot it. I know there was, I think there was very few things that were bound to character at the time. So pretty much what happened was that people got together in these large groups, and they all kind of a lot of things started to develop out of that, like systems to determine who gets the loot. Because you kill this boss, and 3 pieces of loot would drop, but you might have 30 people there. So
right.
You had 3 people getting upgrades, and 27 people not. And so they started to come up with kind of systems for okay, this group will reserve this monster again, because the monsters kind of had a regular respawn time, and so you would you basically had basically people that would basically people that would just kind of band together and basically then reserve the monsters. And this is actually something that's completely outside even the scope of the game. There would be kind of locations where groups that were interested in raiding would say, okay, we're going to take this monster, and then that means this group gets this monster over here, and this group gets this monster over here, that type thing. And a lot of times people kind of spread out over different servers, because each server is kind of independent of each other. They would kind of spread out, and kind of each server kind of had its own set of baddies that people would reserve.
Right.
And eventually it became kind of an ingrained part of the culture, where people would call customer service if somebody basically jumped in line.
That's interesting.
It became something enforced kind of by the customer service people. Oh, we had this thing reserved. Kind of, it was basically going by essentially community rules for this type of thing. And so you had kind of problems. Because it really wasn't really a planned or designed thing, it had a lot of kind of really rough edges to it.
Right, but emergent gameplay.
Right. I mean, this is basically this is emergent gameplay. Obviously they put these monsters out there and they gave them loot, so they kind of expected people to kill them, but they really didn't have a good idea of what the hell is going to go on.
Right, leave it to the players to figure out the details.
Right. Exactly. And so that's one of the things you kind of you kind of dealt with, was the fact that people people kind of came up with a lot of these systems. Kind of then the kind of next iteration was basically World of Warcraft kind of changed things a bit, given that the world was heavily instanced.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, all of a sudden, the raid monsters became part of these instances. Instances would only allow in a certain number of people, based on party size, number of parties and whatnot. And so the bosses kind of essentially started to get more interesting to find mechanics, whereas a lot of the original EverQuest bosses were basically just kind of big pools of hit points that you kind of beat down and you had to
chip away at.
Right, and part of the strategy was, okay, well, how does someone get attention, and then we focus heal on that person. kind of example of the oldie days of raiding, there was this idea called the complete heal chain, where you had a bunch of healers, clerics in this case, that had this spell called complete heal, which actually didn't complete heal, like, because it was
false advertising.
well, I think it was supposed to be complete heal at the beginning, but like then they capped the amount of hit points it healed and whatnot.
Right.
But anyway, so basically what would happen though was that a player, one healer would basically start casting, and after a certain amount of delay, then the next caster would start casting, and then after similar delay, the next caster would start casting. The idea was that basically all these heals would hit at a certain frequency that would be greater than what the tank was taking in damage.
So you're basically just negating auto attacks for the most part.
Kind of, yeah. I think like some of the monsters had like kind of like tank buster moves or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
but
that's kind of similar to some of the healing in 11 at times.
Right. Yeah. Final Fantasy 11 is very heavily obviously derived from the EverQuest model, so. And so kind of then basically like raiding kind of like took on a bit more interesting, because like since you had a limited number of people, you could basically better a little more fine tune how things worked.
It's a little more structured in a sense.
Right, and then you also had the kind of the rise of interesting mechanics,
Mm-hmm.
where instead of like maybe it has an AOE, or maybe it has a bigger hit, or maybe it has an occasional proc, you had like jump phases and dances and moves and stay out of the air.